Welcome to the webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the Child Abuse Training and Technical Assistance Center, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I just want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. You can use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you may have. We will leave time at the end of the presentation for Lunx to answer questions. The chat panel is where you can ask tech support questions. We will answer those immediately in this panel. I'd like to take a moment to welcome our presenter. Lunx Girgado is a 24-year-old, non-binary, queer, transgender person of color. They work at Strength United, Family Justice Center, a California State University Northridge community agency as the Advocacy Coordinator. They have worked with survivors of interpersonal violence at the agency for 3 years. In addition, they are interning with Planned Parenthood Los Angeles as a Sexual Health Educator. With Planned Parenthood, they teach comprehensive sexual health to middle and high school students in the classroom. They graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism with an emphasis in broadcast and a minor in gender and women's studies in 2018 from CSUN Northridge. Please bear with me a moment while I switch the controls over to Lunx.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to share my screen right now. And today we are really going to be talking about working with the LGBT community, specifically with LGBT youth. So that is going up until the age of 24. Again, my name is Lunx. I am the Advocacy Coordinator. I use they, them pronouns. And our Family Justice Center is located in Van Nuys, California. So we service the Santa Clarita Valley and the San Fernando Valley, which is a part of LA County. A little bit about our agency. We have an agency specifically for LGBT survivors of violence. And so our agency provides 24-hour support. We have a hotline, we provide follow-up services, we make sure all of our survivors are treated with respect and dignity, and we offer our individual counseling and our group support for survivors. Today, we are going to be going over the historical framework of the community, some challenges faced within the community, as well as safe and affirming practices. And again, if anyone has questions, you can always direct them to Kelly. We'll have time throughout this presentation towards the end to answer all questions. But for the LGBT community, what we're really talking about is folks that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual, and then additional identities not listed. And the reason why we have this acronym is to allow folks time, space, and privilege to identify with the label that best represents them. Now, I'm not going to be here today defining every single one of these words because I don't identify with all of these words. If you want to know what these words mean, if you're working with someone who identifies as bisexual, identifying queer or asexual, asking them in a comfortable, safe way, what does that mean for you? It's really important to allow people to speak on their own identities. And I'm not going to speak for other people or for other identities that I don't identify with. Also, with this presentation, I do want to give a huge shout out to Marsha P. Johnson, Miss Major, and Sylvia Rivera. These women are the leaders of the LGBT organization, of the movement that we have now. The community doesn't exist without these people, and their work, back then they did so much work and they're still doing work now. Miss Major is still fighting for youth across the country. And so I wouldn't be able to be giving this presentation. I wouldn't be able to be who I am today without these individuals. Something that's really important to talking about gender. And I know sometimes when we talk to youth specifically, it's confusing or it's hard to understand, or what is this gender? What is gender identity? I've never heard of this word before. So this is an example of a gender unicorn. It is a great example to, when you're working with clients, to have a better understanding of what gender identity is, what gender expression is. and sex assigned at birth, as well as physical attraction and emotional attraction. What's really important here is it's a spectrum. Gender and people's expression with gender is a spectrum. So it's not a binary of are they a man, are they a woman? It's completely different. And so what I'll do throughout this presentation is define each one of these sections and really help folks understand the differences and the commonalities between them. So the 5 spectrums. So we'll be going over sex, gender, expression, romantic orientation, and sexual orientation. It's really important. Folks in this community, they are not just one person where their identity is singular. They have multiple identities. They identify with different labels. So it's important to look at each of these as individual parts of someone's identity. So the first one, we're talking about sex. And when we're talking about sex, it's biological sex. So biological anatomy, it's assigned at birth. Female anatomy, historically, it's with vagina, uterus, fallopian tubes, XX chromosomes, estrogen. Male anatomy is talking about a penis, testicles, XY chromosomes, and testosterone. But with the sex binary, there also is a binary. People are only talking about sex from female and male, but 1 in 2,000 individuals identify as intersex. And what that means is someone is born with sexual anatomy that is different. It's a variation of genitals, hormones, and other sex characteristics. So they are not 50% female, they're not 50% male. They identify as intersex. Some folks identify as female or male, even if they were born intersex, and that's okay. So I don't want folks to be scared or fearful. Um, Intersex is an identity and it is a valid experience. Now, the next section that we're talking about is gender. And so when we're talking about gender, gender is this inner sense of self, who they are on the inside, how they feel. And when we talk about gender, it's really rooted in different types of characteristics of sex, race, culture, class. So when we think about the LGBT community, it's a global community. So a lot of what I'm presenting today is a very Western perspective, a very US based perspective. But just know that when we talk about this community, it's going to look different in other places of the world, and that's okay. So when we talk about gender, we're talking about what they identify with. So cisgender. Cisgender just means same gender, so folks that identify with their gender or their sex assigned at birth. So historically, if the doctor says, they're a boy, that person grows up and they still feel like they're a boy, then they are cisgender. If someone identifies as transgender, it basically means when they were born, say they were born a woman or a female, and they grow up and they just don't feel like they're a woman. They don't believe that they're a woman. And they identify as a man or they identify with other gender identities. So we would call that transgender or changing of gender. Non-binary. So I identify as non-binary. So basically what that means is someone's gender identity is not tied to this male-female binary. We live outside of the binary. We challenge the binary and we allow individuals the space and time to be themselves and not be restricted on gender norms or gender expectations. When we talk about expression, it's really talking about gender expression. So, how somebody communicates to the world what their gender is. And that could be from the clothes that they wear, the way they talk, the way they walk, whether or not they wear makeup, whether or not they style their hair in a certain way. All of these things are okay, all of these things are valid. And sometimes folks will conform to the gender that matches the one that was at birth. So, gender conforming. So, if somebody identifies as male, when the doctor said, it's a boy, they're going to dress in a very quote unquote male or boy mentality. There's also that gender conformity for females or people that are feminine. But we do realize that not everyone is going to be masculine presenting, female presenting. And gender expression, it's assumed to match someone's sex assigned and gender assigned at birth, meaning that if you look at me, some people in their mind would automatically assume, oh, they're a boy or they're a man, without actually understanding who I am. So, really looking inside yourself and understanding not everyone you interact with is going to look like the person you think they are. So, never assume someone's gender identity just by looking at them. And so when we talk about non-binary or folks that are outside of the binary or trying to challenge these systems of control and oppression, we talk about gender nonconformity. And so that's basically gender expression that doesn't match with their expectations that were assigned to them when they were born. So, meaning if somebody was a male or female at birth, and they were told their whole life you have to wear dresses or you have to wear button down shirts or you can't wear makeup, people are challenging that, and people are saying no, I want to be who I want to be, I want to express the way I want to express because that makes me feel like a person, that gives me life. But not everybody has this opportunity. So when we talk about gender nonconformity, we have to remember that safety is one of the biggest factors to determine whether or not this person is going to feel comfortable to express their true gender. So, a lot of the times people don't dress the way that they want to dress because they're afraid of getting killed. They're afraid of getting beat up. They're afraid of getting harassed, bullied, sexually assaulted. And so, just because somebody looks a certain way doesn't mean that they're not trans, doesn't mean that they're not gay or bisexual. Who they are on the inside is what matters. And sometimes they can't always be themselves. And that's that privilege that we talk about. And when we talk about orientations, we're talking about two different orientations. So, sexual orientation and romantic orientation. So, sexual orientation, we're talking about how someone is attracted to someone physically. And so that could be in relation to someone else's gender. So, say someone is attracted to men or women or trans folks or non binary individuals. That is someone's sexual orientation. Not everyone has a sexual orientation. So, folks that are asexual have little to no sexual attraction towards individuals. And so folks don't have to have a sexual orientation. Also, with romantic orientation, folks don't have to have romantic feelings. And those romantic feelings are intimate feelings, feelings of closeness, connection, emotion, and psychological, spiritual, and intellectual levels. And again, not everybody has to have romantic feelings. So, really telling folks it's okay if you don't have sexual feelings. It's okay if you don't have romantic feelings. There's nothing wrong with you. That's okay. Another big thing with with our community is talking about transitioning. Now, I know a lot of individuals think that transitioning is just physical in nature, or if people are going to go on hormones or go through any type of surgeries to help their body feel more affirmed with their identity. But we know that transitioning takes all forms. So, social transitioning, legal transitioning, and physical transitioning. And all of these things vary on an individual's access. So when we talk about access, we're talking about that privilege. Not everybody is going to be in a home that is supportive. Not everyone is going to have friends, family, coworkers, loved ones that are going to be supportive of their identity. So there's a huge barrier with that. Also, resources. These things cost money. And unfortunately, because the government has set up transitioning or legal transitioning or physical transitioning, specifically with physical transitioning, they label it as a cosmetic surgery. So, not a lot of insurance providers, not a lot of funding for it. So, folks are paying out of pocket for these expenses. And there is some organizations, some LGBT organizations that are helping folks access these services, these crucial and important services, but not everybody has that privilege. So, not everyone is going to transition. Not everyone is going to come out, and that's okay. You don't have to come out to be valid. You can be trans, you can be gay, you can be bisexual, and you don't have to tell anyone. You, as long as you know, as long as you believe yourself, that's truly all that matters. And so when we talk about transitioning in a social and legal sense, we're talking about coming out socially, coming out with a new name, new pronouns, a new expression. And a lot of people want to think that coming out is this one time thing that, oh, you came out once, that's it. You don't have to come out anymore. That's not true. People come out all of the time. People are coming out with their new names, their pronouns, they're correcting folks, and they're doing this every day. So, with coming out, it's a process and it's never going to end. Folks are going to come out in one way, shape, or form. Also, with legal transitioning, that is changing someone's name on government forms and also changing gender markers on government forms. So, California is one of the states that has a lot of policy that helps folks change their gender markers on their IDs. A couple of years ago, they passed the non binary marker on state IDs so folks can change their gender to have an X for non binary. Also, changing their names on government forms, birth certificates, social security. It's become a lot easier for folks, but still, money, access, time, and resources is crucial. I mentioned with physical transitioning this type of cosmetic surgeries. So, physical transitioning is done by some folks that identify as trans or non binary, not by everyone. So, not everyone who identifies as trans is going to go do the surgery, not, or multiple surgeries. Because when we talk about trans inclusive surgeries, we're talking about multiple procedures. Also, not everyone is going to feel like they need to do these procedures to feel affirmed. So remembering that it all depends on someone's insurance, if they have access to insurance or resources, location to services. In LA County, there is a lot of services for folks that want to go through physical transitioning, but in other parts of the state, in other parts of this nation, in other parts of this world, there isn't as many resources. There isn't as much funding. Insurance is hard to come by. Also, support. We realize now more than ever that LGBT youth and LGBT individuals are with their family members who are not as supportive. They're not able to go to school and hang out with their friends because they're in quarantine. So they were doing online learning. And a lot of people that got that escape to go to their workplace and be their true selves aren't able to do that in the same capacity. And so, again, all of these things, it has privilege, has weight. Also, I mentioned earlier that the government does list physical transitioning as cosmetic surgeries, but we know that it's not. We know that policy lag behind what's going on socially. And so right now, a lot of trans activists are fighting to allow these surgeries to be included as necessary procedures for someone's gender identity. So that way it can be covered on more insurances. That way it can be funded. That way folks can gain access to this. It's really important. Just like I said earlier, not everyone has to transition in order to identify with the gender that they assign with. People don't have to come out if they don't want to. And trans people are more than just their bodies. So if you meet a trans person, if you're working with a trans person, don't automatically become fixed on what their body looks like or what genitalia they have, because it's not your right to know that unless you're doing something for a medical interview and you need more information about a medical aspect, or you're getting information for a forensic interview, a forensic exam, or you're working with a survivor and you just need more information, do so in a very careful way, a very sensitive way, and a very affirming way. So don't outright ask people, about surgeries, hormones, or genitalia. Allow them to start that conversation. Allow them to open up. Give them the space to feel comfortable and safe. This is a very huge thing, not just in the LGBT community, but around the world. So, intersectionality, it's basically when someone's identities are overlapping, intersecting, and they're relating to systems of oppression. They're relating to systems of dominance and discrimination. So, a lot of times when we look at intersectionality, we need to remember that not every person in the LGBT community is going to look white. Not everyone in the LGBT community is going to look like a man or male. We need to look beyond our stereotypes. We need to look beyond what the media is showing us. We need to look beyond what TV shows and other things are showing us and begin to understand that someone's gender identity could look different than mine, and they could identify in the community. Someone's race or ethnicity could look different than mine. Someone's ability, when we talk about ableism, that is a very big aspect of people's identities that are being ignored, that they're not being allowed to be themselves. And so when we talk about intersectionality, we're talking about it from a micro perspective and a macro perspective. So when we talk about micro perspectives with LGBT common issues and discrimination, we see bathroom policies that are not being inclusive. We see the military, attacking trans folks, even if they want to serve this country. We see that folks aren't allowed to, or there's more restrictions, or there's more barriers. We look at adoption services. We look at how some adoption services, they're discriminating against the community or making it harder for folks in the community to adopt children because of these stereotypes, these ideas that you have to have two parents that are a man and a woman. That's how you have to raise a child. But that's not true because people come in families, people live in families of diverse backgrounds and of diverse identities, and they're all healthy, normal, and totally accepting. Also, school. We see a ton of school based discrimination with our youth. We see youth being bullied in schools. I know right now, because of the quarantine and schools moving to digital learning, a lot more cyberbullying has been happening. A lot more people have been targeted through the internet and social media to discriminate against them and harass them. So there's that happening on a global scale all the time. We look at access to social services, specifically with housing, with employment, with medical care, mental health. We, as an agency, a family justice center, we are trying to break down those barriers. We are trying to connect people with services that are inclusive for them. And so, housing services, employment, medical care, mental health, if you're referring an LGBT youth to an organization that is outside, that's an outside organization, make sure you vet that organization. Make sure that that organization is affirming. Make sure that they have policies that can help their clients who identify as LGBT. See if they have an LGBT therapist. Do all of this work because you don't want to refer a client to a shelter and then they get denied because they're trans. That's happened to me in the past where I've called shelters on behalf of my client and they denied my client because they were trans and they didn't fit the binary. And that's extremely unfortunate, extremely dangerous, and not okay. So making those calls is really important and a part of your job. Also, education. We see a lot of disparities with folks accessing higher education. We see the privilege in accessing it with money and resources and time. Police brutality. This whole week, this whole month, this whole year, we've been saying this. Police brutality is never okay. Black Lives Matter. Trans Black Lives Matter. Yesterday, a couple days ago, there was a Black trans woman that was beat up. This is happening. Last week, a Black trans man was murdered. So this stuff is still happening, and we need to make sure that we're including LGBT people when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. We need to make sure that we go back to our roots and understand that Stonewall was a riot, was a protest about police brutality, corruption, racism, homophobia, transphobia. And so, we've come a long way, but we still have so much that we still need to fight for in our community. So when we talk about the LGBT community, we really need to make sure that we're putting minorities, specifically people of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, on the front lines, giving them resources, access, equality, justice, and equity. When we look at bathrooms and locker rooms, I know this isn't as important right now, because a lot of people are staying home, a lot of people are accessing a bathroom that is safer for them or more comfortable for them. But we know that when students, LGBT youth, go back to the classroom, go back to these school sites, they're not going to feel affirmed. They don't feel safe using bathrooms at school. When you go to school, you're supposed to learn. You're supposed to be thinking about your exams. You're supposed to be thinking about, seeing your friends, extracurriculars, and all of these things. But for LGBT youth and survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, they are constantly being told that they have to use a bathroom that doesn't align with them or they don't feel safe or comfortable. And a lot of these youth don't know about school policy. And not a lot of these youth don't know that they could, make accommodations. They can see what school sites have inclusive bathrooms. They can fight for inclusive restrooms on their campus for folks to use. And so, really empowering youth and telling them that they have these rights, that they have these choices, and that they can fight for what they believe in. Also, school based bullying. I mentioned it earlier in this presentation. We're not seeing a lot of school based bullying in the classroom, we're seeing it more on social media, but we know that folks, when they go back into the classroom, they're going to see huge numbers of discrimination. They're going to see huge numbers, and not a lot of states are going to protect them. So the reason why I wanted to talk about policy so much in this presentation is because policy is important. Our agencies, our social services can only do so much if the policies are not in place to protect trans folks, LGBT folks. California, like I mentioned, in other states, they're more inclusive. They have anti-bullying laws that protect LGBT youth, but that's not all 50 states. So we need to make sure that all 50 states are inclusive. We need to make sure that all 50 states are making sure that, trans folks, people in the community are being protected. And 73% of LGBT folks have experienced verbal threats because of their actual or perceived identity. 73%. And that number is probably a lot higher because, again, when we look at reports, when we look at statistics, it only tells one piece of the puzzle. Conversion therapy. This is another thing that isn't talked a lot about, and it really should be talked a lot about more because these children, these youth, are survivors of violence. This form of violence is not okay. It's torture. And in a lot of states, it is still legal. When we look at this map right here, we look at where it's been banned, all of the dark green sections. That's not a lot of states. It's again California, Nevada, New York, a lot of the coastal cities and coastal states. But we need to make sure that we are making sure that these youth in the middle of America, middle of our nation are protected. Places like Kansas, places like Texas, because a lot of the times parents they will take their child across state lines and put them in a conversion camp in Texas to convert them, to, pray the gay away, to remove their identity. And this is harmful. This is not okay. And this should not be happening in 2020. This should not be happening at all. So fighting for these policies and making sure that youth are protected. Because just like our Family Justice Center, we see folks across this nation. So yes, our services are for LA County, but we have folks that come here from Texas. We have folks that come here from Washington or Pennsylvania. And so we need to be really careful and really informed about the policies and what's going on and making sure that we fight for the policies to be inclusive. Now, I also want to talk about micro or meso level, so that's individual or community-based discrimination. And so when we're talking about invalidation, misgendering, dead naming, questioning about expression, experiences, assuming someone's partner or family dynamics, lack of representation, all of these things are super important. But now think about it from COVID, think about it from the quarantine. These LGBT youth that went to schools to feel safe are now home. And some people who are LGBT youth are not in homes that are affirming. So they're constantly being misgendered. They're constantly being dead named. They're constantly being invalidated. and erased for who they are. When we look at LGBT youth, we see that one of the leading causes of death is suicide among youth, and we need to be careful when we are working with youth now more than ever that they are protected, that we are making sure that they go home in a safe way, in a safe manner. We make sure that the resources we give them are inclusive. And if you ever don't know if a resource is inclusive, call that resource, like I mentioned, before you give it to a client, because you never want to have a client call an agency and be misgendered, be discriminated against, because that survivor just worked so hard to call and now they're back to square one. We never want to disempower people. We want to empower them. Also, tokenization, we see this a lot. So tokenization is basically when one person, one individual now needs to speak for the whole community. Take Black Lives Matter. A lot of people want to start tokenizing people of color, Black people, and say, oh, can you speak on this movement? Oh, can you speak on this? And it's like, no, this is a whole community. We cannot say one person needs to speak for this whole community. We can have conversations with people, we can talk to people, but we are not going to ask people to go on a podium and speak on all of these issues when we know that these issues are diverse. We know that there's so many people out there with different stories that we need to hear all of their stories. Also, when we look at family disownment, so that is a spectrum of acceptance. So when we talk about family support, we're going to have some folks that are going to be in an inclusive household, or we're going to have folks that are in an affirming household. But we need to remember that just because somebody is accepted doesn't mean that their gender identity is affirmed. That doesn't mean that their pronouns are being used. Just because your family member accepts you isn't enough. We need to make sure that these family members are calling them by their chosen name and their pronouns that they're given. Isolation and finding community, now more than ever. LGBT youth are isolated. They're experiencing a lot of re-victimization and a lot of triggering experiences being at home and being back in the closet in some way, shape, or form. When I talk about microaggressions, I'm talking about these words, these jokes, these phrases that people are saying that people think are a joke, or they're, oh, it's funny, it's fine, it's not hurtful. These things, that are being said, you don't look trans, I have friends who are trans, you are too pretty to be a lesbian, you don't act gay. These are microaggressions where we don't mean to hurt someone, we don't mean to offend someone, but we did. So intentions don't always equal impact. So just because someone didn't intend to harm that individual doesn't mean that individual wasn't harmed. So if someone says these things, or if someone says anything racist, homophobic, transphobic, use your privilege. If you have privilege, and talk to that person in a safe way and say, hey, that is not okay. And the reason why we want this to stop is because if more people stop making these comments, making these jokes, we will then see a trend of inclusiveness, of support, less violence, less crimes, less folks in the community being assaulted, being murdered. And so when we look at youth specifically, I have been talking a lot about family, and I mentioned it earlier, but family acceptance is very important for the development of the child. It's going to promote adolescent health and well-being. Also, studies have shown, like all of you are aware, that if you are in a supportive, accepting, and inclusive household, you will have greater self-esteem, resiliency, and lower risk factors for health outcomes that are negative health outcomes, such as depression, stress, hopelessness, and substance abuse. Another thing that we want to mention is a lot of people that are youth are experiencing a lot of problems at home. So only 24% of LGBT youth can definitely be themselves as an LGBT person at home. They're at home all of the time now, 24/7. And you're saying these statistics were from the Human Rights Campaign from 2018. They had a youth report for the LGBT community. 24% feel like they can be themselves. That's not okay. When we look at this other statistic, only 25% of LGBT youth have families who show support for them getting involved and being an ally. These numbers are terrible. We are, 2020. This has gone long enough. We need to make sure that people are being affirming, and we cannot let people um, be hurtful to these youth, because we know that if they are going to be in harm's way, in danger, how are they going to feel safe if their family doesn't treat them with respect? 67% of youth have heard their family make negative comments about LGBT people. 78% of youth have not come out to their parents because of fear from those negative statements. So a lot of youth are scared. A lot of youth don't feel empowered. And so when that youth comes to your agency, just think how many hurdles, how many barriers they had to get through to call you. So know that when you're talking with an LGBT youth over the phone or providing support for them or services for them, be mindful. Ask them, introduce yourself with your pronouns. Talk about inclusive services that you have. Let them know that they can be themselves. So that way they can have a space to open up, because they might not have that space at home. When we talk about interpersonal violence, we're talking about all types of violence. So the reason why this presentation is talking about youth survivors, LGBT youth survivors, is because this interpersonal spectrum of violence is a spectrum. There's a lot of different things that can happen to someone, ranging from stalking, sexual harassment, verbal abuse, name calling, child sexual abuse, cyber harassment, stalking, human trafficking, intimate partner violence, or domestic violence. So all of these things are connected, and it is a continuum, and all of these forms of violence are violence. So we need to call it for what it is. We should not be minimizing people's experiences with violence. We should not be telling them, oh, that wasn't traumatic, or that wasn't violent. I'm like, no, if they experience something like this, that is violence, and that is not okay. Another thing, when we talk about stigma, a lot of folks are familiar with power and control. When we talk about interpersonal violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, but for people in the community, we have the standard wheel of power and control, but now add another layer. Add transphobia. So folks that hate people who are transgender, who want to cause harm to people who are trans, homophobia, biphobia. And then let's take it another step further. Let's add racism, let's add classism, let's add ableism. And all of these barriers have now made it increasingly harder for this individual to leave, has now made this situation even more scary for someone, because now their options have been reduced. So we need to be very careful, service providers, to make sure that our services do not reinforce transphobia, that do not reinforce biphobia or heterosexism, or this idea that heterosexuality is the norm. Thank you. I'm reading all of your comments, so I really appreciate all the comments that are being said. Thank you. When we talk about violence, we know as service providers that violence for the LGBT community, specifically for youth, experience higher rates of violence than non-LGBT youth. Now, some folks would say, but they're not coming into my agency. They're not calling our agency. We don't know that. Just because they're not reporting it doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because they're not calling the police, just because they're not getting a forensic interview or forensic exam, doesn't mean that LGBT youth are not experiencing violence. And so when we talk about violence, we're talking about all forms, like we mentioned earlier: physical, verbal, social, emotional, and digital, or online. When we talk about cyberbullying, a lot of people don't realize the danger, don't realize the implication of cyberbullying, of harassment, of outing someone online. A couple years ago, there was an LGBT youth that was outed on social media, and they took their own life because they knew that they couldn't handle the world. They couldn't be themselves because they were not going to be accepted. And so we need to be very careful that if someone is being outed on social media, that we protect them, that we make sure that that person gets resources, making sure that they don't feel like their only option is suicide, because we know that there's more options out there and we need to protect these youth. With cyberbullying, a lot of folks are experiencing that 24/7. Back in the day when I was younger, social media wasn't as prevalent as it is now, but there's so many different ways that somebody could interact with another individual, whether that's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, um, TikTok is very popular with the youth. And so it's like these youth are constantly being told that they are a problem. They're constantly being told that they should kill themselves, that homosexuality is a choice, all of these things on a daily basis. And then imagine this LGBT youth experiencing all that harassment online to go to a household that is also damaging, that is also toxic. Um, so it's really important to keep that in mind. Another thing, when we talk about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it's going to be a little bit different for people in the community. So when we talk about this stuff, we need to remember that the abuser, the person that is causing harm, is going to say, no one is going to love you because you're trans. I'm the only person that will love you. On top of physically abusing them, emotionally abusing them, sexually assaulting them. STI status is super huge. The reason why I put it on here is because in the 80s and 90s with the AIDS epidemic, we still live with that stigma today. People still have difficult time talking about HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, or AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And so when we talk about HIV and AIDS, a lot of folks, a lot of youth, a lot of people in the community are fearful. A lot of them are scared of that stigma. They don't want to be labeled as dirty or wrong or sinful. And I just want to say, when we talk about STIs, that is completely, it's normal. It's okay. They're very common. And no one is dirty, disrespectful, disgusting because they have an STI. Also, with HIV and AIDS, someone cannot just get AIDS. Some people, there's still that misconception today that people think that they're going to get AIDS. Someone can get HIV if left untreated, if they don't get access to the appropriate treatment, then HIV can break down their immune system, make their immune system so weak, and it will develop into AIDS. That's really important. So that psychoeducation for youth is crucial, because we want to make sure that youth are not spreading misinformation. We want to make sure that youth are staying informed and educating others around them. Because if we really want to see change in this world, we need to make sure that these youth are informed, protected, and advocating for folks if they can. Also at the bottom of this presentation, this slide, I have the word clocking. And so clocking basically means outing someone without their consent. Clocking did have another definition. It does have another definition. So clocking is like physically punching them, beating them up. But for LGBT individuals, specifically youth, they're using this word clocking because they're being outed. It's like, oh, that person just clocked me. They just said like, oh, look at that guy over there. Look at that girl over there. It's like, oh, they just clocked me. They just outed me without my consent, and that's not okay. So if you hear folks saying this word or using this word, just ask them, what does that mean to you? Can you give me an example of this, just in case you're on the same page, making sure that there's no miscommunication. A lot of youth speak in acronyms or phrases or really popular slang. So if youth are saying something that you don't fully understand, don't just assume you know what they're talking about. Ask them what they're talking about. Get to understand what's going on, because that's ultimately how you're going to protect them. Also, with the primary aggressor, they're going to use all the standard forms of tactics to limit the person's options. So isolating them, restricting them, coercion, punishment, and then they're going to add that layer of there isn't LGBT services. You're not going to get access to these services. You're not going to get help. No one's going to believe you. All of these things for the community. So the abuser knows to use these things. Also, gaslighting. So that's very prevalent with youth. A lot of people a lot of youth are using the word gaslighting as a term to define denying the abuse. So basically, the abuser would say, "Oh, I'm not abusing you. That's not abuse. I didn't do that. That didn't happen. I don't know what you're talking about. That you're crazy. That didn't happen." And so that is what gaslighting is, and that's not okay. And for a lot of people that are youth, specifically in the community, are disempowered. And sometimes when a person in the community hears, "I believe you, I am here for you, I support you, I will help you," for a lot of these youth, that will help them feel like they can escape. That can help them feel like they have power, that they have choices, they have options. So now I'm going to do some true and false. I don't know if folks want to just put true and false in the chat, totally fine. But the first question is talking about the abuser is usually more masculine, stronger, and larger, while the victim is usually more feminine, weaker, or smaller. True or false? Okay. Okay. False, 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 false. Exactly, exactly. Right on it. So the abuser is not larger or smaller or bigger or stronger. Exerting power doesn't require that the abuser be larger or physically stronger. But society, heterosexism, this idea of man and woman, you have to be heterosexual, this is the norm, women are victims, men are perpetrators. We have these biases, we have these understandings in our mind, and we need to unlearn that. We need to take ourselves out of that conversation and really look at situations of abuse for what they are. We cannot go into a situation working with a survivor and say, "Oh, they're the abuser because they look like this," or "They're the survivor because they look like this," because that's basically society is telling us to believe these things, to reinforce them. Also, when we talk about sexual assault and rape, thank you for folks that participated in the chat. Um, I really do love that feature of Zoom. It's like super interactive. When we talk about sexual assault and rape, these are reported numbers. So 11% of youth report that they've been sexually attacked or raped because of their actual or assumed gender identity. 77% of LGBT youth receive unwanted sexual comments, jokes, and gestures, and 20% of LGBT youth say they were forced to do something sexually without their consent. And so these statistics, they don't tell the whole story, but we know that folks in the community are more vulnerable to being sexually assaulted. We know that folks are being discriminated and attacked for who they are. Also, another aspect that is very big and prevalent in our community is talking about sexual assault in public spaces. So I know right now, because of the quarantine, the stay-at-home order, places like bars, clubs, restaurants aren't open in their full capacity. Folks aren't engaging in going to clubs, consuming alcohol, and using drugs. But for a lot of youth, this is what they're told. This is what they are said, like, "Oh, to be gay is to go to West Hollywood and go to clubs and drink and, party." And so you're basically telling LGBT youth that they need to consume alcohol, that LGBT youth need to use drugs to be cool. You're telling that LGBT youth need to engage in these spaces to be valid. Guess what? People are going to be LGBT, and some people are not going to go to clubs. Some people like watching TV shows at home, reading books, going for a walk, riding a bike, all of these things. And we cannot just assume that somebody in the community is going to want to have sex, going to engage in sexual activities, use things like alcohol and drugs, or party and go out. We don't have to automatically assume that for youth. Also, I mentioned it earlier, but barriers to seeking services. So this is in the mind of an LGBT youth. This is what's going through their mind before they call you, before they report, before they reach out for support. So fear of legal services. How will authorities treat me? That's exactly what's happening right now. With the Black Lives Matter movement, we know that police brutality, corruption, racism, and oppression are happening. So people are thinking about this. Also, for social services, will they believe me? Will they serve me? Will I have to educate everyone? How many times do I have to disclose my story to come out? What's really important here is that you're doing the work, right? You are being vocal. You are being an ally. You're not being a performative ally and just saying, oh, we stand with Black Lives Matter. Oh, we are LGBT inclusive. What are you doing on the front lines to help people in the community? How are you advertising your services? How are you talking about your services? What about your intake forms? Are your intake forms inclusive? Are they talking about pronouns? Are they including sexual orientation or gender identity? Are they including spaces for chosen names? So that way people can feel affirmed. Also, fear of the stereotype. So a lot of folks that are in the community see those statistics, right? And they don't want to be another statistic. Youth don't want to be labeled as a problem or that they did something wrong because of their identity. Because someone is sexually assaulted because that person took control away from that survivor. It's not because they are trans that they got assaulted. It's not because they are gay they got assaulted. We need to really be careful with the language that we use, because what you're telling youth, what you're telling survivors in the community is it's your fault that you're gay, it's your fault that you're trans, and that's not the case. They were targeted because of their identity, but their identity did not cause the sexual assault. The abuser did, the person that assaulted them did. So placing the blame on the appropriate person. And fear of support, like I mentioned. A lot of social services aren't inclusive. A lot of programming isn't inclusive. When we look at shelter programming, a lot of folks are denied the community because they don't meet the criteria or there's no space for them. And so when we talk about barriers to receiving services, we look at gender segregated facilities, restrooms, spaces. We need to make sure that all of our spaces going back into the office are inclusive. So if your agency doesn't have a gender inclusive restroom, use the time right now to fight for that. Use the time right now to make sure that your agency is inclusive. So when you open those doors again, you are ready to help people in this community. Use this time. Also, fear of being outed, not just by their partner. So when they really talked about all of these things, they are really scared. Privacy is super important for them. And then when we look at, fear of not being accepted, fear of losing their family members or supportive services, and also fear of being cut off from the community. So another thing that's super big and things that youth are talking about is, oh, I don't want to come forward because that person is in my community and I don't want to hurt my community. I don't want to blame my community or be ostracized by my community. I still want that person to be supported. So people are also thinking about that as well. And so when we talk about all of these services, one in five LGBT survivors of IPV and sexual assault or sexual violence receive services, gain access to services. 1 in 5. That number needs to be 5 in 5. And if that number doesn't change in 5 years, we have a problem. We need to make sure that we are not allowing people to fall through the cracks. So doing your job in terms of following up with people, making sure so that warm handoff to a resource or referral is given. So that way we are not put in a position where people are ostracized. Safe and affirming practices. And so when we talk about all these things, we want to be really mindful about our spaces. Right now, we, in some way, shape, or form, are using virtual spaces. So on Zoom, making sure that your name and your pronoun are on your Zoom profile. So that way people know. People know that these are my pronouns, I'm being inclusive, I'm allowing folks to open up and to talk about stuff in a safe manner. Also, be prepared to welcome people of diverse and inclusive perspectives. So don't be off-put by someone's experience or don't be off-put by the way that they look. Challenge those biases. Just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean they're going to cause harm to you. So you really need to look in yourself for those answers. Unlearn those systems of racism, oppression, discrimination. What am I doing to challenge racism? What am I doing to challenge oppression? And it's really great to have, pride flags, buttons, lanyards, stickers. That's great, but do more. So don't just put a flag in the lobby and be like, awesome, we did it. We can support LGBT people. That's one part of the battle. So you need to make sure that you're constantly doing this. I also want to acknowledge this quote by Audre Lorde. And this quote is really important, really crucial for our work. So you do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. You do not have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. Think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Think about the LGBTQIA plus movement. We don't have to be the same in order to fight for justice for everyone. And we are not free. We are not all free until every one of us is free. So we need to make sure that everyone is free. Also, really important for LGBT trainings and welcoming environments, make sure that you are in contact with local LGBT organizations. Reach out to them, offer support to them, co-host an event with them, allow them space and time at your agency to talk about their services. Also see if they have resources, pamphlets, brochures that you can display in your office so that way folks can access these services. With trainings, make sure that everyone is trained at your agency. It is not enough just to have counselors, volunteers, hotline workers, front office staff to be trained on LGBT cultural competency. Everyone, executive directors, program managers, associate directors, coordinators need to be doing this work, and they need to be engaging in these trainings. And then another thing when we talk about assumptions, where do you stand? Do you make assumptions? Do you have unconscious or conscious biases? Do you form opinions about people before getting to know them? Do you have predetermined feelings or notions about a particular culture without truly having an understanding of that culture? So think about it. What do I do in my life and how can I change it to make sure that people are supported? Always ask, never assume, because if you assume something, you have the potential to cause harm. You have the potential for that person to not be safe. You have that potential for that survivor to not leave their abuser. You need to make sure that you always ask questions that are important. So their name, their pronoun, also asking how it's safe for them to leave their abuser. What is safety planning looking like for them? Always ask what they have access to and what they don't have access to, because safety planning with clients is going to be different for every individual, but you need to ask the questions in order to understand where they're at. And one of the biggest things on this slide, it's in red, if you misgender someone, apologize briefly. Use the right gender inclusive language and move on. If I accidentally misgender someone, I'll be like, I'm so sorry. I meant she, her. Thank you, move on. Don't be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I just didn't understand. Like, I don't want to like hurt your feelings. Like, it's not about you. A lot of stuff when we talk about the community, we need to make sure that we're centering the community and we're not making it about ourselves. This is an example about pronouns. I'm just going to skip through it. But basically what I want with this slide is in every meeting that you go to, say, hi, my name is Lunx Girgado, or whatever your name is. Here are my pronouns. I use they, them pronouns. I am the Advocacy Coordinator. So that way everybody can start talking about their pronouns. That way we're not just going to assume that I use he pronouns, or I'm not going to assume that person over there uses she pronouns. We need to make sure that we're not misgendering people. Also, inclusive language. I know a lot of people still say, you guys, say like, how are you doing, ladies, women, gentlemen? Let's refrain from that. We need to make sure that we're keeping youth, LGBT community in mind. So we need to be inclusive with our language. the English language is gender neutral. And so with this, we need to make sure that we are saying folks, we're saying everyone, hi everyone, how are you all doing? How are you both doing? Because we want to make sure that people are respected. I do have a few more slides, so I'll just wrap up very quickly so that way we have time for questions. But these two slides are super important. So when coming out to people or when people are coming out to you, say that thank you. Thank you so much for coming out to me. I'm here for you. If you need any support, I respect you. I respect your privacy and allow them space to open up. If someone comes out to at your agency and they're youth, always ask, who can I share this information with? Your name, your chosen pronouns, your gender identity. Because there's going to be times where caregivers don't know their chosen name, don't know that they identify in the community. And we need to make sure that we respect people's privacy and keep them safe. So if we have to talk to that youth and say, hey, for right now, I'm going to be using your legal name in front of your parents. I'm going to be using your pronouns he, him, but just know when we are talking, when it's just you and me in a room, I know what your chosen name is. I know what your pronouns are. I believe you. I just want to keep you safe in this moment. So that way we don't have a situation where you out someone, right? Where you breach someone's privacy and now they're outed without their consent. And then also lastly with law enforcement, I'll say this now more than ever, people in the community are fearful of law enforcement. I mentioned this in New York last year when I talked to NYPD, and I'll mention it again here. When we talk about police brutality, when we talk about corruption, when we talk about oppression, we need to make sure that when we talk about LGBT youth, that they're protected, that making sure that that officer or that law enforcement agency or that station is inclusive, and making sure that those law enforcement officers that you work with are being trained. I know a lot of them are being trained now, but continual education, making sure that we don't have a situation where they misgender them. They don't have a situation where they're not affirmed by the officer or the law enforcement agency, and then they're not believed, or they recant their statement, or they don't come forward because they're not being affirmed. Now that concludes my presentation. There was a few other slides, but for the most part, that is all I have today. So I want to open the floor for questions, any type of comments. I really want this to be a time for us to engage.
Thank you, Lunx. I can start by asking some questions that people had already submitted while you were presenting or before you were presenting, and that'll give everyone else a chance to type out their questions meanwhile. So the first one that I'm going to ask is, can you talk more about some of the health disparities that the LGBTQ community faces? Because you touched on that, but can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Definitely, definitely. So when we look at health disparities, it's all connected, right? So when we look at survivors in a very vulnerable or sensitive population, they are going to be more susceptible to depression, more types of diseases or infections, more types of cancer. And so a lot of the times when people aren't affirmed, when they're an LGBT youth or an LGBT person, they're going to have more anxiety, more stress. They're going to develop some forms of PTSD. They're not going to feel like they are truly themselves. And that's because our society is really telling these people that they're the problem. So all of these things can be indicators of health risks and health factors. But if we do our part and step in and prevent those barriers, those feelings, those anxieties from happening, we can really make sure that LGBT youth have higher health outcomes, making sure that LGBT youth live till they're 35, 45 years old. Because for the average age of a trans person, it's 20 years old. So we have to be really careful about that. Awesome. Good question.
So we have a few more that are popping up right now.
Okay.
Do you have any resources for foster parents housing LGBTQIA youth, or any resources for youth in rural areas as well?
Yes, 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 yes. So for LGBT specifically, for shelter-based or for any housing resources, really connecting with the local LGBT organization that you are partnered with, that's in your service area. So getting familiar with their resources and seeing who they can go to, who are their go-to shelters. And then sometimes you are going to be doing cold calls. So you're going to be calling shelters and asking them, hey, so do you accept folks in the LGBT community? If so, what capacity do you accept them? What are the requirements? What are the barriers? So that way, when you're doing an intake with a survivor, you can let them know, like, hey, this shelter is inclusive. These are some of the common requirements and things of that nature, specifically with resources, with foster. One of the great organizations is Penny Lanes. So Penny Lanes has a lot of resources for foster youth, for foster parents, for folks in the foster system. So I lean a lot of my time and resources to Penny Lanes. They're a really great organization. And as for rural LGBT individuals, there are activists in rural parts of America that are doing this work. There's a lot of grassroots organizations in middle America. So that means for us, what are we doing to research that? We need to make sure that we're researching these things, calling people, emailing people, having them, come on a Zoom call and talking about their agency and spreading the word. Last year, I spoke in San Diego at another conference, and I had folks in Mississippi, I had folks in Alabama, I had folks in Georgia talking about the LGBT work that they're doing. So they're doing this work. We just don't know about it all of the time.
And so we had two questions about those who work in schools. So I'll kind of combine the questions. So someone just said that they work in several schools that are not necessarily they're behind on their knowledge with supporting and affirming the LGBTQ community. So how would what resources would you recommend for that? How would you recommend that person makes a change in that community when they're not necessarily they work with the school, they don't work at the school?
Definitely, definitely. I think I do this a lot with my work with Planned Parenthood. So with Planned Parenthood, we offer inclusive sexual health care. So we go to schools and we talk to the teachers beforehand and we let them know, hey, these are some group agreements, hey, these are some ground rules. And so having those conversations with teachers, hopefully those teachers can take what you're telling them, that information, to their principals, to their administrators, and seeing if they can have policy written, seeing they can adapt change. A lot of people in school-based agencies have the capacity to do these things. We just need to make sure that parents are aware of certain things in terms of policies and making sure that if LGBT youth want to access policies that are inclusive for their school, fighting for it. I think a lot of times we think that youth are powerless, but that's not true. I spoke to seventh graders last year, and I was talking to them about queer activism. And these seventh graders, with the support of one of their teachers, was able to get the school to put pride flags in every classroom because those students wanted that. Those students needed that. And so sometimes that teacher and those students can be the change. So if you're that community agency that's not the school but affiliated with the school, you can help them get to where they need to be.
And then another question, multiple people have asked some iteration of this. How can if someone comes out to me, how can I refer them and show that support?
Definitely, definitely. So seeing what they disclose to you, right? So if they come out to you with a new name or with a new pronoun or with a new identity, that's different than the name that you thought it was, or maybe listed differently, just say, thank you so much. Like, thank you for letting me know this. I really appreciate that. Just so you know, I also use these pronouns, or I use these pronouns. So having that dialogue with youth. So it's not necessarily like looking towards them, asking them all the questions about themselves, because you know they're human. You know that their identity might be different than yours, but that doesn't mean that you treat them differently. You make sure that your services and the way that you talk to them is inclusive. So maybe it's changing the way that you talk to people around them. What if you're using not inclusive language around them? So being very mindful about the words you're using. Also, if they do have new pronouns, making sure you use the right pronouns. So after meeting me, if I use they, them pronouns, don't continue to use the wrong pronouns. Use the correct pronouns. And if you ever have a question or you're ever confused about something, always talking to that youth in a private space, one-on-one, or not an earshot of like a public space or a public area, and making sure that you have those conversations, because ultimately building rapport, it's so crucial, it's difficult, but it's the little things that matter. And those little things will really open the door on whether or not that person that just came out to you will come back, whether or not that person will call you back, access those resources again. That's a really good question.
So I have another one. Someone said, I have clients whose parents don't understand their identity. What resources can I give to them?
Definitely, definitely. So I think this is where using online resources like the Trevor Project, using the Human Rights Campaign website, using other like LGBT organizations. So like the Los Angeles LGBT organization is great. The New York LGBT organization is great. So sometimes having psychoeducation with the parents and providing information that is accessible, through the internet, through online channels, and having a conversation about, okay, so if you don't agree or you don't necessarily believe or this, that, or the other thing, how can we make sure that you're being supportive of your child? How can we make sure that their basic needs are met? How can we make sure that they're being loved, that they're getting the resources that they need? And so a lot of the times parents might be fearful. A lot of the times parents are projecting their own traumas. Maybe they saw how LGBT people are discriminated against. They saw, their loved ones dying of HIV or AIDS. And so they have this negative perception of people in the community. So sometimes having those conversations, no matter how basic, no matter how trivial they might seem, it might help someone. It might help a parent open up and really get to the root of why they're being discriminating against that youth that is their child, why they're hating on them, why they're oppressing them.
And so that was the last question that we had. I'm not sure if anybody has any more. I might.
I did see like a
Let's
question about the acronym. So some folks were saying like, what are your thoughts on like a different acronym? And ultimately, I wish I could be like, yeah, let's change it. Ultimately, like it's whatever the community feels is best. And as a community, we're ever changing. It's the language, the flags that we use, the identities, the way that we define things are changing. So that's okay. So ultimately, we're not going to have a cookie cutter, like this is the acronym, this is always going to be the acronym, because we know the LGBT organization, the movement, was the gay and lesbian liberation movement. So even that changed. The words when we say queer, that also has changed as well. Historically, queer was used as this derogatory term, this hateful word to say you're weird, you're different, you're disgusting. Now people are reclaiming that. So I'm okay with the LGBTQIA plus acronym. I'm okay with having a lot of these labels and a lot of these identities. And some people aren't going to identify with labels, and that's okay too. So ultimately, it's really up to the individual and what the community decides is best.
So we have two more questions.
Okay.
One says, the person asked, did I hear you correctly? Average age expectancy of a transgender youth is 20?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like about there roughly. Most folks don't live past their 40th birthday, and that are trans, specifically Black trans women. When we look at these things, we need to be very careful to refer them to the appropriate places, to make sure that when they call your agency, that you give them the support and the space to be themselves. Because for a lot of people, a lot of trans people, they don't live to a long age. Like, I'm grateful that I'm, 24 years old, and I hope to live the rest of my life, however long that is. But I know for folks in my community, we don't have that privilege.
And I have another one. This is a really good question
Okay.
here. Where can I find culturally sensitive resources when discussing this topic with youth and their parents that may not be from here?
Good question. So again, leaning on those organizations. So there's a lot of organizations that have LGBT documents in multiple languages. So if, say, they come from a country that speaks a different language, there's a lot of agencies right now. So if you need those specific agencies, I can provide those for you, those PDFs, those resources, because we do understand that the LGBT community is culturally diverse. So we're going to have a lot of individuals that are not going to speak English. A lot of individuals are going to speak Spanish or Japanese or other things. So making sure that our messaging and our pamphlets and our information is inclusive. Luckily, we've come a long way with resources and accessing stuff online. So there's a lot of resources now as opposed to back in the day. So if you do need support with that, just send me an email. My email's in the PowerPoint, and I can definitely help you with all of those resources.
And this is a good time for me to let everybody know. I know that I've typed this out, but we will be sharing the presentation. The presentation's recorded, so we'll have a link so you can share it with your colleagues who hadn't seen it. We will also be sharing the PowerPoint, which includes Lunx's contact information, and you can reach out and ask for anything specific that you may need. We do have a few more of these coming in. Let's see,
Okay.
do you
I
have
see a few
suggestions?
questions.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you're good. You're good. I'm just reading aloud.
I got it. Okay. Do you have suggestions to help assist a youth who's questioning their sexual orientation?
Yeah, definitely. We had a few youth that came to our center for counseling that were questioning, that didn't know information. So what I did, I was one of the advocates that was in the room with them, and we were just having a conversation about these things, about sexual orientation, about gender, and how it's a lifelong process. And it's okay if you identify with a label right now, and later down the line, you feel like a different label is okay for you. That's all right. A lot of people can change their name however many times that they need to. They can change their pronouns however many times that they need to. I know for myself, I didn't always identify with queer. I didn't know queer was a thing. I didn't know people could identify as queer. So just helping them access information that they may not be aware of is so crucial. And this process, like we mentioned, it's not a one and done conversation. So if they're thinking about it now, that's okay. They can think about it for months. They can think about it for years. There's no rush. There's no perfect time to come out. They can come out, they can identify, they can choose a label when they're ready. And that's all right. Thank you for your question. Let me see. I
And
see
we
another
do,
question. Yeah.
yes, yeah. So we have, is the sex binary always maintained by doctors at birth for folks born intersex?
Thank you for asking this question. Thank you. So this is a very, very important question. So a lot of the times, sadly, it's really unfortunate that doctors are talking to the parents and deciding for the child. Like, okay, this person, this child is born intersex, we can change their genitalia. So genital mutilation. So doctors are, with the parents' consent, generally mutilating people's genitals to look more female or to look more male. And so what ends up happening for folks that are intersex is they don't find out until later in life that they are intersex, that their physical anatomy is different. And they didn't realize that the doctor, with their parents, decided to make a life-changing decision for them without their permission. And so, yes, doctors are maintaining this sex binary. Doctors, I know a lot of states and a lot of work right now is trying to fight that in terms of policy, and we're trying to make that illegal, a federal offense. Making sure that people that are intersex make decisions for themselves, what's best for them later on in life. So it's definitely an ongoing conversation, but a conversation that is still being had to this day. I see another question. How do you support parents who are not accepting of how their child identifies but still supports youth? Okay. So ultimately, we see this a lot, that spectrum of acceptance, right? So yeah, they can accept their identity, but ultimately, like, they're just not going to get it, or like it's just not going to fully be something that they're going to be on board with. So ultimately, it's like validating the parent too, just saying like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. That is your right. That is your opinion. But ultimately, if you're supporting your child with those basic needs, that's okay. And then telling the child about chosen family. So letting the child know, like, not everyone is going to treat you this way. People are going to be accepting of you. People are going to love you. And sometimes that's not going to be biological parents or biological family members. So ultimately, it's what's best for the child. So if the child knows within their heart who they are, and they believe in themselves, and you support them, then they don't necessarily need to lean on their parents for that support because they have you or another friend or a family member. So if that support system is being utilized in a different space, not every parent needs to be 100% accepting. Not every child needs to have their parent be 100% accepting, because we know for a lot of youth, that's not the case. And for a lot of youth, we don't have that privilege or that right. Oh, I love it. Someone asked, how do you use they, them pronouns appropriately? I love it. So recently, they, them pronouns has been changed in the dictionary. So it is a singular pronoun. So think of it like you would he, him, she, her. So for myself, I'll say Lunx Girgado works at Strength United. They work at Strength United. Strength United is a great organization for them. So basically, it's just replacing the he, him, she, her with they, them. It is a singular pronoun, so you can use it in a singular form. I know it's a little bit different just because we're used to they, them being multiple or plural, which it is still the case, but it's just changing our language. So it's an ongoing process, and if you use it incorrectly, it's okay. You can start over. No worries.
And so I think it looks like that was the last question. We got a lot of people saying that your presentation was beautiful. Thanking you for that. So that's really exciting. I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of CIR, all the attendees. We really appreciate you taking the time. And we will definitely be sending out the presentation along with any resources and a recording of the video for everyone to share. So thank you again, Lunx, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.